Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Joanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is T.S. McMillin. Dr. McMillin is a professor of English and literary scholar at Oberlin College. He received a Distinguished Teaching Award from Oberlin College for 2020 and was named Thomas J. Klutznick Fellow in the Humanities for 2021. He is the author of a number of articles on literature and the environmental humanities. His books include Our Preposterous Use of Literature, Emerson and the Nature of Reading, The Meaning of Rivers, Flow and Reflection in American Literature, and an open access digital book on the Los Angeles River called Strange Waters. In 2016, he was a participating member in an initiative of the United Nations titled Harmony with Nature. This is a special episode of Context specifically for teachers. Dr. McMillin was a favorite scholar at the recent Teacher Institute by the IHC called An Environment of Hope that focused on the environmental humanities. Dr. McMillin will be presenting in audio and video format. If you are listening through our podcast, you can view his complete presentation on YouTube. Dr. McMillin, thank you for joining me today to teach us about the Blue Humanities.
For having me, Joanna. It's great to see you again and to be working with you at IHC. I'm going to share my screen now as we get started. I'm hoping with this presentation on the Blue Humanities to contribute to your work by giving you another way of thinking about what you do as educators. I'm very conscious of the pressures that are already upon you as a teacher. One of my favorite writers, William James, wrote quite a while ago that our teachers are overworked already. Everyone who adds a jot or tittle of unnecessary weight to their burden is a foe of education. I do not mean for this presentation to be a foe of education. I'm hoping to not add a jot or a tittle of burden to the work that you do. In fact, I'm hoping to perhaps lessen it by giving you a different perspective for thinking about what it is that you do. As an educator, you probably know that education is one of those areas where hope begins. Education can actually change one's being through changing the ways one lives in the world. William James, again, wrote that education consists in the organizing of resources in the human being, of powers of conduct which shall fit human beings to their social and physical world. Education can change human beings by adjusting the ways in which we behave. The ways in which we behave in various spheres. And it does this by changing our habits. As James put it, education is for behavior, and habits are the stuff of which behavior consists. You can see in a passage from James's late 19th century book, Talks to Teachers, that he's pretty serious about this habit business. He says that that's what we're made of. Our lives as humans is made of habits, and these habits taken together push us forward, drag us forward into wherever it is we may be going. With that in mind, you might consider education then as something like gardening, as pruning some habits, nourishing others. And then the question becomes, what habits do we want to cultivate in our students? That question was on my mind as I designed this presentation. And I'm going to give you a brief map now of the things that I'd like to cover today. We'll start off thinking about why teach the Blue Humanities, but why teach? Looking at underlying principles and goals of teaching in general. I'll be thinking a lot about connectivity and connection here. The whys and the wherefores of education are made up of this kind of connectivity, I think. And the question, a way to put this question would be, why do you want to cultivate certain habits in other people? How is it that you can contribute to the way people can change through working on their habits? Why do you want to do that? And then the second part of the presentation, we're thinking about what you might teach in teaching the Blue Humanities, a little bit more about what the Blue Humanities are, thinking with you about curricular questions and using water and flow to inform education. Here, it's asking again, what habits do you want to cultivate in people? And then finally, we'll conclude with how to teach Blue Humanities, some thoughts on approaches to and methods of teaching, how to change students' habits. I'll be emphasizing provocation here in education as well as reflection. And all of this is really about the Blue Humanities, which have to do with water. That's the blue part. Environmental humanities is a larger field of which Blue Humanities is a subset. Water, really important. It connects with just about everything that we do. It's ubiquitous, except where it isn't, and that can be a real problem. It's very familiar, we know water well, and yet there are things about it that we don't know, that we are quite unfamiliar with. So water has a lot to offer us as teachers in thinking about how to get students interested in the work that we have before them. The humanities are in general about connections, and the Blue Humanities use water to help us think about those connections. So why teach Blue Humanities? Connections are important to me. I'm interested in, as a teacher, I've been interested in connecting what goes on in the classroom to life more generally. I had experiences as a student in which I felt that the teachers weren't really interested in connecting education to life. They were covering particular things that they had to cover that were important, that they were charged with covering, that sort of thing by their duties. But it wasn't always clear to me as a student how this connected with living, with being a better person, with changing my habits, as it were. So connections are important, and humanities are really about connections, especially literature, my main area of teaching. That literature involves making connections, connecting the reader's world to the writer's world, helping us think in unaccustomed ways, cultivating empathy, which is a special kind of connection with other beings, connecting the past and the present, connecting the future and the present, connecting different parts of the present to one another. Certain ways of thinking about connections can better equip us to deal with the myriad problems we face. Ginny Odell, in a recent book of hers, wrote that given that all of the issues that face us demand an understanding of complexity, interrelationship, and nuance, the ability to seek and understand context is nothing less than a collective survival skill. It was nice of Ginny Odell to mention the title of this show in her passage, but the important things there are thinking in context. Humanities are built upon complexity. They are built upon interrelationship and nuance, and as such, they might constitute a collective survival skill in helping us think about context, where we are. And then, as Marilynne Robinson asks, once we know where we are, what are we doing here? Why are we here? You might think about it in that light. Marilynne Robinson is a novelist, an essayist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a National Humanities medalist, and a native of Idaho. When she visited my school to talk about education, she referred to the importance of teaching the great American writers, teaching literature, chief among whom she listed Emerson and Thoreau, which I liked very much, having written about them quite a bit in my career. She gave special attention in her talk to another talk, to Ralph Waldo Emerson's Divinity School address, in which he is connecting education to action and religion to reform, teaching and learning to change. In that Divinity School address, Emerson was talking to the graduates of his alma mater, Harvard University, and he really stirred things up, so much so that he wasn't invited back to talk at Harvard for another 30 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but what I want to think about here is this changing business, our capacity for change makes us what we are, Marilyn Robinson says. Why? Why do we teach to change habits? Why are we doing that? Why do we want to change habits? Because there are some habits that can cause all kinds of problems for individuals and society and the world that we inhabit. What we are doing here, why we are doing what we're doing here, are questions that are really useful to ask on a very basic level as we go about our day-to-day business. Humanities is the area of studies in which it's quite common to ask, what are we doing here? How have we changed? How can we change? How might we change for the future? And asking these basic questions, deliberating on ways of responding, imagining alternatives, these are all forms of making connections with the past and the present, with the present and the future. Teaching literature for me is a way of addressing despair by fostering hope and perhaps pursuing wisdom. So that's why I teach. That's one of the reasons why I teach. I see a lot of despair. I want to try to do something about that. I want to have more hope and more wisdom, which are, I believe, antidotes to despair. Study after study tells us that despair is increasing in the US, especially among our students. Hope and wisdom, if they are antidotes to despair, are something we should be cultivating. And thinking, particular ways of thinking, is a means by which we might cultivate hope and pursue wisdom. Thoreau, whom Robinson mentioned, wrote about quiet desperation, a famous passage from Walden, and he uses different cognates of that word in the passage. He uses desperation, desperate, despair, and he concludes by saying, it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. Desperate, desperation, despair. Thoreau gets us thinking about different modes of that one thing. Desperation is recklessness or violence that is due to despair. It means suffering unbearable need or anxiety. And despair, utter lack of hope. So we might think of what we could do, why we do what we do, as the opportunity for substituting habits of hope for habits of desperation and despair through fostering hope with literature, for example. Emerson, in his essay Circles, asks us to consider the nature of hope. It's more than just optimism. Hope isn't just expectation coupled with desire, as some dictionaries put it. That definition, a definition such as that, is too passive. In my definition, hope is something active. It's a sense of or belief in the possibility for a situation to change, generally for the better, and the openness in participating in fostering change. And I think that's the kind of hope that Emerson is writing about in his essay Circles. In that essay, he defines literature and talks about the uses of literature as a kind of unsettling of people. And that, he proposes, is a necessary condition for hope. Literature is something outside of our day-to-day experiences, our day-to-day circle, our habits of living, our habitual worldview. So if literature is something outside of that, that gives it properties that may enable literature to change our habits. And Emerson says that the use of literature is to afford us a platform whence we may command a view of our present life and a purchase by which we may move it. Different ways of standing, getting a perspective, standing, looking over something, getting a height to see what's going on around you, and then a stance, a purchase, a strong stance from which you can change things. He writes in that essay that people wish to be settled only as far as they are unsettled. Is there any hope for them? We wish to be settled. We like our habits. We habitually like our habits. We're accustomed to them, used to them. It's familiar. Literature, teaching are ways of unsettling those habits. And that is a necessary condition, at least according to Emerson, for hope then to go forward. It's not just unsettling. It's not just shaking people up. He certainly did that in that particular talk, which is why he wasn't invited back. But it's also connecting, unsettling as a way of connecting or reconnecting. making connections, belonging to the world, participating in the world. Unsettling is also a way of flowing, of getting the flow going, of moving connectedly and connectively with the change and adapting to life as it changes around us. And unsettling also involves a kind of reflecting, a reviewing, a reseeing, a rethinking of the world that we inhabit. Teaching then is bringing hope into the classroom so students can carry it with them beyond. In another essay, Emerson writes about teachers and scholars being bringers of hope in order to strengthen the people we teach. And the Blue Humanities are a way of promoting an effective kind of this learning made from connection, flow, and reflection. Connecting literature and nature, for example, the literary, the humanities with the environmental part, connecting words and place, connecting meaning and being. And then there's flowing, moving between disciplines within the humanities, flowing together in the classroom, flowing between the classroom and the world beyond it, what people call real life. And then there's reflecting on what we are learning and why it might matter. All those things are very important to the humanities, which is why the humanities could be important to the changing of habits. The humanities can improve our thinking then by nourishing connections. Science writer Annie Murphy-Paul, in a recent book, wrote about our minds being like magpies, and that our minds, when we think, are doing things like magpies do when they're making nests and the like. They're finding things from all over the place and weaving them together. And Annie Murphy-Paul's point in this is that our minds do not just operate in a vacuum, detached from everything, sitting around thinking great thoughts. Our minds are actually connected to all kinds of things. The mind doesn't think on its own. It thinks always connected to a body, always connected to places where that body and mind are, and always connected to other beings, even when they aren't easily recognized as being present. So Annie Murphy-Paul suggests that we can learn to think better by attending to those connections. And teaching literature has been a way for me to make those connections happen and bring them to students' attention, helping students connect with a text and helping them connect that text to context, helping them connect the text to their lives. This is why, one of the main reasons why I've taught courses that bring literature and nature together. When I first started thinking about nature and the classroom and how to do more with how that works, I was much younger, and I had a very young son, and he had this ritual. When I tucked him in at night, he would tell me a secret. And on one occasion, getting things all ready, and he whispers, "Dad, I've got a secret." So I get there close and ask him what it is, and he says, "Dad, nature is everything." And I thought, yes, you are right, Jack. Nature is everything. So if you want to teach a course that is connecting students, helping students connect literature and nature, you're basically trying to help them connect with everything, which is a good place to start, but also a challenging place to start, because everything is a lot. There's a lot going on with everything. It includes so many different things. So you have to help students think about nature. And that's one of the places where water comes in, and teaching the Blue Humanities. Nature's a big idea, and it's hard to get one's head around it. Water, especially rivers, is a way of grounding a big idea like that, and making a big idea like that a little closer, a little realer, perhaps bringing it to life. It's easy to sort of objectify and abstract nature and have it just out there as this everything, this big idea. Water is a way of bringing it a little closer to home. There is a passage from another book of Thoreau's, his first book, in which he writes about what we might call as the danger of dry thinking. This is actually a really funny passage, and one of the things that readers of Thoreau these days often forget is he was a jokester. And here he's being purposefully funny, playing with words, using words like methinks. I mean, even in Thoreau's day, people didn't walk around saying methinks this or methinks that. So he's messing around with his prose, and he's trying to get people to think about their worldviews, which can often be our schemes of the universe, as he puts it. Our worldviews, our habitual way of seeing the world, can often be really cut and dried, as Thoreau says. Cut into rigid lines, put into particular places, and everything has to fall into those places, all the new stuff that we meet. That's a habitual way of thinking there. So that's one of the meanings that he's playing with regarding the dryness in these schemes. But then he also talks about how if you start to tell somebody else your scheme of the universe, your worldview, it can come across as really, really dry. And both of these qualities of dryness for Thoreau suggest ways in which our worldviews and our discussion of them are disconnected from life, are dried up, not living anymore. So he's trying to, in his literary works, water our ways of thinking, make our thinking more fluid. And that is a way of watering hope, at least for Thoreau. And that's one of the things I've tried to do with my teaching, is to try to enliven things, joke around a little, but also to help students make connections with things that they're learning to the world that they're living in. I'd like you to take a minute to pause this presentation now and just jot down some ideas about why you teach what you teach. I think it's worthwhile to just step back for a moment and consider your own reasons, your own rationales for doing these sorts of things. I teach because I want to change habits. I teach because I want to overcome despair. I teach because I want to substitute hope and wisdom for despair. I teach to help students make connections and so on. Why do you teach? Just take a moment. And while you're doing that, I'll move us on to the second part of the presentation. Okay, welcome back. I hope that you took some time to write a few things down. What to teach when you teach Blue Humanities. A lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to discuss a few of them in this section of the course. Begin by thinking about some of the characteristics of this kind of teaching, flow and interpretation being really important parts of it. Then I'm going to give you a couple different types of courses or units that you might include in your teaching. And throughout, I'm hoping that you will be imagining a model that might work for you. Let's say you had to teach something involving the Blue Humanities. How would you do it? What would you want to do with it? So be thinking about that, jotting down some notes. And at the end of this section, I'll encourage you to take a pause and write down a few more things. So flow is one of those things that first comes to mind in thinking about rivers. It's one of the major defining attributes of rivers, occasionally definitive through flow's absence. So where drought is in play, or where it's a very slow flowing river, it becomes almost lake-like in some cases. Sometimes flow is too much. Think of flooding and think of the overabundance of flowing waters overwhelming us. But here we're thinking about connection and flow of water and thinking through literature. And if you think about flow, it's really this really important quality, an important component of the whole Earth's hydrologic cycle. Without the flow of rivers, we wouldn't have the same kind of hydrologic cycle that we have. Flow is also something useful for our thinking, to make our thinking less dry, we might say. If you, in studying rivers, one of the things that I found from the very beginning was when I told somebody what it is that I do, they would say, well, you can't step in the same river twice. People really like that. It's one of those catchphrases that sticks with our, let us say, cut and dried schemes of the universe. And so I've had to think about it probably more times than I wanted to, but it's actually a useful way of thinking about paradox, the way that rivers change and don't change, change and unchangingness of our very selves, and what flow can teach us regarding those things. Flow and movement are themselves a kind of change. Flow and change and meaning making are ways in which, well, they're involved in interpretation, in our making sense of things. And to interpret a text or to interpret a body of knowledge that we've been given, one of the things we have to do is consider how we might participate in the flow of meaning in relation to that particular subject, that particular text or thing that we're trying to understand. And the humanities, literature especially, and its likes, are really concerned with interpretation as much as anything else. And it's because of that concern with interpretation that makes literature, to me, the heart of humanities, a nexus of the multiplicity of connections that make up the field of the humanities. I want to say very strongly that literature, at least to me, is not fancy writing. It's not something that we should approach on tiptoe, whispering reverently in its presence and receiving the truth unquestioningly on bended knee from some author. Literature is writing that raises questions, writing that provokes thought, writing that merits continuing interpretation. Interpretation is the special sort of thinking, then, an interpretation that is central to the humanities. And the Blue Humanities are largely concerned with interpreting texts that have something to do with water, using literature to think about nature or rivers, let's say, and using rivers or water to think about literature and life, using the flow of rivers, the flow of time to organize a unit in a course or something like that. There are different types of courses that I want to talk to you about briefly. And again, I'd like you to be imagining one that might best fit your situation, and encourage you to write some notes about this. The first of these two courses, and they're both based on my book that appeared in 2011, The Meaning of Rivers. And I'm going to give you two different types of courses that use that book. One of them has to do with a concept-based approach, and the other has to do with a watershed-based approach. The book in this book, I asked the question, what do rivers mean and what have rivers meant? And I used literature to bring out some of those meanings. And it was intended to be a primer, kind of introduction to people who were interested in rivers but hadn't thought much about literature, or interested in literature and hadn't thought much about rivers. And it's largely, because I was writing it while I was developing a course about it, it's largely meant to be for teachers and students and helping them think about these connections between rivers and literature. The concept-based course is in a field that I laughingly call textual bottomology, a term that I made up. I just like the highfalutin aspect of it, and I wanted it to suggest the connection between the literary and the river, something that we do throughout. So in this concept-based course, I follow the breakdowns of the different ways of experiencing the flow of the river that I used in the book itself. Those involve, as you can see on the screen, overlooking the river, being right down close by the river. So overlooking the river can be neglecting it, not paying attention to it, but also way up above it and looking down on it, looking out over a large part of the river. By the river, you're up close, you're right alongside it, you're in it, but usually staying still as the river flows around you. In down the river or up the river texts, the writer or main characters either do one or the other. And you can, as you can tell, going down the river is going to give you different experiences than going up the river will. And these differences are reflected in their text and bring up different kinds of questions regarding our connections to life. Crossing the river is going from one side to the other, and you can do that in different ways. You can go once and for all, like Washington crossing the Delaware, or you can do it repeatedly, like commuters going back and forth across the border. Up and down is the most complex. It's when you go out and come back by the same route, and that double way of experiencing the flow of a river or other river, or more than one river, can bring out different sorts of things, as you might imagine, because of the very complexity. The course that I've taught in this concept-based approach was again developed while I was writing the book and uses those categories. And I've tried different ways of using the book in the class itself, sometimes giving parts of it to students to read as introductions to works we were going to be studying in a given week, sometimes assigning parts of the book after we had studied a particular text, helping students wrap up or round out some of the discussions that we've had. And then sometimes not assigning the book at all, just using the materials as part of my lecture, helping students understand the context of particular works that we were studying. Very literary, very concept-based, using the parts of the book one after the other. The other approach, the watershed-based course, one that I'm familiar with, is taught by a colleague of mine, a scientist, biologist, Mary Garvin, and she used The Meaning of Rivers, my book, to inform students' experiences in the field, combining the work of a humanist with that of the naturalist. She's incorporating Blue Humanities into a science-based course. This can be team taught, as Mary Garvin found out, sometimes teaching it in conjunction with a humanist, and folding things together in that class, or taught solo by Mary herself, using The Meaning of Rivers to guide intensive study of a local stream, the Vermilion River. She follows the order of chapters in the book and used the intro to develop themes and plan activities. They would read a chapter from my book, go to the field, and then write a reflection based on a particular way of experiencing the flow of the river. For example, after they read By the River, they studied the geology of the Vermilion River watershed, followed by the river experiences at two particular locations. They read the chapter Crossing, and then used that to think about aquatic invertebrates, freshwater mussels of the Vermilion River, crossing the river at a particular place where there's a confluence, and thinking about what the nature of that crossing revealed regarding their interests in the Vermilion River. In a section on Up the River, they read that chapter and then walked up a section of the river for about an hour. They sat and observed the river and wrote in their journal for 20 minutes or so and then discussed. Professor Garvin says that walking trips were key here. They give you more time to think, feel, and connect with what's beneath your feet. As she put it in her syllabus, there are these weekly field trips that are helping students make connections between different aspects of flow. The field work here is key. Sitting alone, going slowly, no cell phones, etc. Emphasizing observation, experiential observation of particular parts of the river. The field work for Professor Garvin's class was based on conditions. Like the fall semester, it was warm enough to actually get into the water, and not always the case in the spring semesters here in Ohio. It was also based on processes that are going on in the seasons, like when were certain plants leafing out, when were clams available, things along that line, and then she would adjust that to with chapters of the book. She included trips to the Natural History Museum, to the Art Museum, to observe, for example, how Thomas Cole's paintings reflect some of the things they were thinking about in their course. They visited many sites in their field trips, and for a longer assignment, students picked one site and returned to it periodically throughout the semester and charted changes that they noticed in their experiences. Professor Garvin says that field trips are always worth the effort unless there's a cock-up, which things can happen when you're taking people around. I found the same thing. I wasn't always able to teach a course that allowed for field trips, but I always have benefited from doing that. The concept-based course is a little cleaner in that regard, but perhaps maybe even a little bit drier because of that. A couple other place-based models for courses in the Blue Humanities, from left to right, one on the Mississippi, one on London, and one on Los Angeles. The one on the left, Ben Groth, former student of mine, has taught a history course at Tulane University called The Old South. He included a series of lectures that were inspired by Meaning of Rivers, focused on the Mississippi. So going up the river, down the river, and across the river. And as Ben Groth put it, students also read River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom by Walter Johnson. The middle one, I did a course. Our college has a program in which we take overland students to London for a semester, and I did a course there on words written on water. This was London-based, and looking at multiple forms of water, not just rivers. And it was divided into three main parts: interpretation, fieldwork, and writing. The interpretation of literary treatments of water in British literature was a big part of it. We read fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. We read graphic novels, histories of underground rivers, short stories, poetry, a novel, memoirs, essays on wild swimming. The field of observation took place regarding different kinds of water, different manifestations of water in British culture. There was an emphasis on London and the River Thames, but we also went to the fountains and ponds of Hyde Park, along the course of the now hidden Tyburn River, an underground river. We walked through the busy city on the sidewalks along the course of this ancient river, Tyburn. We went to the Hampstead Heath pools and asked the swimmers there why they were swimming in 30-degree weather. We took a float down the Regent's Canal and thought about how canals work. We explored wetlands. And then the third part of it was writing, and we explored different ways of writing effectively about water in the 21st century. What do we have to do now in writing about these things to bring out the meaning of water for people? In this case, we tried different kinds of writing. We wrote a glossary of key words. We wrote a catalog poem. We wrote what's called a haibun, or a short reflective prose paragraph followed by a haiku. We did sound maps. We wrote essays. I was thinking that with this London-based course, an Idaho-based version might include springs, hot springs, groundwater, drought, different usages, sections of a river, water treatment plants. There are many different ways of approaching water, and helping students think about those differences can add to a lot of clearer understanding of life in a way. Finally, the LA River unit that you see in the far right of the screen, based on my research on the LA River, this is what I've been working on most recently. I've got a book in that URL at the bottom. It's an open access digital book, free to everyone who wants to use it, something that you could potentially use in teaching were you so inclined. In this case, there are three sections to the book. One is on nonfiction, and that's connected with the middle of the river and with the concept of mapping. The second section is on fiction, and that's connected with the mouth of the river and paradoxes, like when is a river not a river. And then the third section is on poetry, and it is based in the headwaters and thinking about the idea of home. Here again, the Idaho version, you might choose a particular place, choose a key concept, find associated text, make a digital presentation or a poster or something like that on a particular aspect of a particular river or a particular another manifestation of water. If you would, I would encourage you to take another minute or two to reflect on these things, look over and add to your notes, and for a possible course or unit using the Blue Humanities. And then we'll move on to the last section of the presentation. How to teach Blue Humanities. I've used rivers in literature in all of my courses, even those that aren't river-based. I teach nature in many of the courses that I work on. In all of those courses, emphasizing questions I found to be really important. Emphasizing questions for further thinking. And here, provocation plays an important role in that further thinking. Interpretation is a crucial aspect of teaching Blue Humanities, and reflection is also an important way to put things together in a particular course or unit. Questions are a way of modeling further thinking. As I'm sure you found out, how you teach is what you teach. Think about the things that you probably already know, I've found it useful to remind myself periodically of basic precepts and practices, and that's aided by thinking about the why of teaching. But in this case, thinking about how to teach, I know I have learned that complacence and passivity and cliche are the enemies of successful teaching. I have run aground on various river expeditions on those rocks, and you just have to remember that from time to time and think about what's going on when you fall into habits such as that. Good teaching should encourage and exemplify good thinking practices. As William James put it, the teacher who meets with the most success is the teacher whose own ways are the most imitable. Questions are a way of modeling that kind of thinking, I think. I think it's important to ask many questions to allow for a response, to foster response, to connect responses to one another, from one response to another, from the response to a particular lesson that you're trying to get at on a given day. This is the importance of action, of anti-passivity, as it were, of active learning. As James put it, no reception without reaction, no impression without correlative expression. That need to express what you're learning, that opportunity to express the kinds of questions that you've been raising and thoughts on how to respond to those questions is crucial to the actual getting of those things in the first place. Good questions help keep students involved. Time to think about questions and opportunity for sharing thinking keeps the process active. Provocation here is a key. And again, it was in the Divinity School address that Emerson brought up this idea forward of provoking your students. He said that he distinguishes between provocation and instruction. And here he's thinking about the roots of the word provocation. So it's not just stirring something up or bothering somebody. Provocation comes from provocare, which means calling forth in Latin. Instruction involves putting something in students, usually information, adding something to something. Provocation is calling forth, getting students to think, bringing out their thoughts, maybe even calling forth wisdom, not really trying to put anything in them. And Emerson again proposed that teachers concern themselves more with provocation than they had been. Too much instruction in a way. Interpretation is a way of fostering provocation, I think. And I've come up with a formula that I've used through the years in which I say that interpretation is examination times explication times extrapolation plus revision or reflection. And I want to explain that briefly. This kind of interpretation is a sort of hands-on activity in which you are living out provocation of a kind. The examination and explication and extrapolation are multiplied together to signify that they don't happen in a clean series. It's not that you sit down and examine the text, pay attention to its details, and then you begin to explicate and explain certain parts of it, and then you start to infer larger meanings. It's more the case that those things are always going on, and sometimes we get more excited about one than the other. Sometimes we even forget to do one of them. And when we do that, we are undercutting what a full interpretation can do with a text. So I help students remember what goes on in interpretation, and we practice this over and over and over again. Having them think about these different modes and practicing them in different ways. So with examining, again, you're paying careful attention to the text itself. You're looking at those different sorts of qualities like when does this take place? What's going on in it? Who are the main characters? What are some central themes? That kind of thing. And one of the things you can do to cultivate examination is ask students to provide a kind of descriptive overview of the thing as a whole. What are all of the details when you put them together and organize them that tell us something about this particular text? In explicating, you are explaining particular parts, and here I found it useful to look at key passages in a text and really spend time unfolding the meanings of that passage. And that includes connecting it to where it is in the original, because things mean different things in different places. These words mean something in particular at this place, and they would have meant something different in another place. So connecting the passage to its original context and then connecting that to the whole of the text taken more largely. And in extrapolation, this inferring of larger meanings, actually, this can move well beyond the text. It's asking questions that come out of your interpretation of a text and thinking about what the text can tell you about something like home or flow or what have you. Again, these don't just happen in a succession. Before you begin examining a text, you've already started to infer larger meanings about it, like teacher assigned this, so it must be important, or I'm going to hate this because teacher assigned it, or whatever. But these things are always happening in different ways at different times, and it's good to sort through them and allow students to not only think about each particular aspect, but then to connect them and remember that they're informing one another all the time. And that's one of the things you can do in revision. That's why that is added on at the end there, that reviewing or rethinking. You'll go back over and think about how all of this works. Do you need to examine more? Are there other details you might consider? How would you explain this particular passage that otherwise doesn't make sense to you? And so forth. Going over again, re-seeing, seeing differently, anew, rethinking, revising. Can also think of that revision as returning, retracing, remembering, going over previously covered ground and removing through the same place from a different direction, going back into the past, bringing the past into the present, or what have you. Asking again, what are we doing here? Reflecting, revision. This is a key aspect of interpretation, a kind of thinking. So with that formula, you can tackle a particular set of works or just a single work. And one example that I thought might be useful to you, how you might put this together, is to take a theme such as home, being at home. That is it's important to all of us in some way or another. Home traditionally means the place where one dwells, or the place where one belongs, or the place where one is from. Another meaning of home, though, is the place from which we are estranged, the place where we no longer belong, whether through exile or immigration or alienation. When we think of the city as separate from nature, for example, we accept a certain kind of alienation as part of a particular version of human history. We were part of nature a long, long time ago. We belonged there in nature. It was our home. But as we became more, quote unquote, civilized, we increasingly moved away from nature and threw our lot in with culture. And those things are separate. That is one way of looking at home, or using home to think about where we are and what we are doing here. You can provoke students to think home by practicing different modes of interpretation. And you don't always have to do everything all at once with a given text. I think shorter texts work best here. Thinking with a given text, what do you think home means in this text? How does a given literary work define home? Go slowly, allow yourself time, and give your students responsibility for interpreting text. So, for example, you could practice examination only with a particular work. And one of the things I did at the presentation at the Institute this summer is ask participants to examine the title of the Langston Hughes poem, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." Think about each of those words. What details do you notice in that title? And how would you describe that to other people then? In practicing explication, we looked at a sentence from an essay by Kathleen Dean Moore called "The Willamette." And we looked at this one particular passage that comes near the end of the essay. And we thought about a very short one. And we thought about what the key words were in that passage. We thought about those key words further. How do you describe the denotation of a key word as opposed to the connotation? Home, for example, the denotation would be the dictionary definition. But the connotation could be all kinds of things, and each text is going to offer different kinds of connotations for a key term such as that. And then you connect the denotations and the connotations to one another. You connect the passage to its original context. Where is it and what does it mean in that particular place? Connect it to the whole. And then, very importantly, explain the passage to somebody who's unfamiliar with the text. That helps students really think deeply about the nature of a particular kind of text. And we practiced extrapolation by thinking about A River Runs Through It, the Norman McLean novella, and taking meanings from that story and going well beyond the story, thinking, so what? I just read that story. Why does it matter? What does it tell me about home and rivers? And when you're in this section, when you're in this aspect of interpretation, you may not even need the title of the text or specifics of the text. You're moving to these larger questions and making this matter on a different level beyond the text and sometimes even beyond the classroom. So that's about it. Reflection is a key part of all of this. Connection, flow, they all go together. The reflection sends us back to why and what. We think of the how as being connected with the why and the what, and how do these different things go together? How might they go together? If you think in terms of the process of unhabituating someone or rehabituating someone, very tricky business. What habits do you want to get? What habits do you want to cultivate? What habits do you want students to have? These are habits of thinking, habits of behaving, ways of being in the world. Education, it's all about those habits, changing them, help others, making the best of our time on the planet. Thank you. I hope that's of some use to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMillin. We really appreciate you being with us today.
It was my pleasure, Joanna. All the best wishes to you.
Thank you.